have if I lived here. I have a suspicion that many of you have been frustrated in trying to get answers from regulatory agencies. And so I'm going to try to answer that which may not have been answered, but I also need you to recognize that there is a great deal that simply isn't known, and part of what you may walk away from this meeting with is a frustration that we really don't know how safe or how dangerous things are. So I want to give you the results of 2 studies that we're releasing today, and if you have questions, I think it's fine to interrupt and deal with those. If we can delay them till the end, great. But let's just try to get through this for you. So this is what we're going to be addressing today. You all know about the Tetra Tech scandal. So there we go. But we're also going to tell you about the untold radiological history. A lot more went on here than most anybody realizes. Much more nuclear activity. The regulatory agencies have failed in their jobs. You all have been concerned about the Parcel A survey. I'm going to try to identify for you the inadequacies in that survey. And then here are some of the key systemic flaws of the cleanup. And this is astonishing. Most of Hunters Point was not tested. 90% of Hunters Point roughly was simply declared not possible to be impacted, and they didn't need to even check to find out if that was true. We now know, most recently from the radium source that was found here, but from much else, that that simply isn't the case. Most of the radionuclides weren't tested. Yes?
You're talking about Hunters Point, you're talking about Hunters Point Shipyard?
I should be clear, yes, Hunters Point Shipyard. So most of the shipyard was not tested at all. And most of the tests that have been done couldn't detect radionuclides at the cleanup levels. This is particularly of concern for you in Parcel A because of this show that Department of Public Health did of wandering around with essentially a Geiger counter. But those detectors couldn't detect alpha radiation, beta radiation, or even most gamma radionuclides at the levels that have been set as required in cleanup. So even with those deficiencies, it's astonishing that they found something. They found something in a place where it's not supposed to be, and that raises the fundamental question you all have, is there other radioactivity that they haven't found? And we're going to touch on this briefly. The cleanup standards that are being used are ancient, going back to the 60s, and you're supposed to be using current EPA standards, and the standards that they're using are often hundreds or thousands of times weaker than the standards that they should be using. So you all know about the Tetra Tech scandal. Here's the letter from the EPA region, and it tells you that 97% of the survey units were suspect. This next chart is the most amazing table I've ever seen. I've dealt with these issues for half a century. They had a category called no signs of falsification found in the data. I'm sorry, let's go back one, sorry. So this is Parcel G, and 3% of the data had no signs of falsification. Can you imagine? First of all, you wonder, joking, how did Tetra Tech manage to miss that 3%, right? They fabricated 97% of the measurements in Parcel G. I am having trouble with this. Can someone help me, tell me what I'm doing wrong? Okay, Parcel G, there we go. Parcel B, 10% were free of fabrication. Parcels UC 1, 2, 3, and D2, again, only 3% free of falsification. Hundreds of millions of dollars spent, and almost all of the samples falsified. Now you're asking all the same questions anyone would ask. How could that be? US Navy contractor, how could the Navy not catch that? This didn't occur for a week or a month, but for years. This is a Superfund site. Under the law, it's called CERCLA, EPA has to sign off on every major document. EPA's headquarters is a bicycle's ride from here. How could they miss this for that many years? This is a federal facility which has a federal facility agreement with the state, the Toxics Agency, and the California Department of Public Health, and the San Francisco Department of Public Health signed off on every one of these things. How could they have missed the fabrication? So it gets worse. The Tetra Tech scandal is just the tip of the iceberg. Repeat, it's just the tip of the iceberg. What we have discovered is that the Navy has ignored the likelihood of widespread contamination throughout the entire shipyard. It's not just that the measurements that were made were falsified. The big scandal is the measurements that weren't made. It's the old Sherlock Holmes business of the dog that didn't bark. So this is what I want to tell you about the two studies. The first one is that there was vastly more nuclear activity here than the public has been led to believe. Most people have thought that what happened was maybe there were a couple of ships that were somehow tainted with some radioactivity that were berthed here. There might have been a couple other unspecified activities that occurred here. Vastly more. Hunters Point was involved in nuclear activity from the dawn of the nuclear era. On July 16th at 6:30 in the morning, the ship, the USS Indianapolis, sailed out of Hunters Point, waited 2 hours until they got word that the first nuclear test at Alamogordo, New Mexico had been successful, and then steamed off to Tinian Island.
What year?
1945, carried with it the components of a bomb called Little Boy, and half of the highly enriched uranium in the world. It went to Tinian, the bomb was placed on the Enola Gay, which flew over Hiroshima and destroyed that city. So Hunters Point was involved from day one. Less than a year later, the first post-war nuclear tests occurred in the Pacific, in the Bikini Atoll. This was called Operation Crossroads, and it went very bad from the beginning. Can you move them a little bit? Sorry. It went awry from the beginning. The first test, called Able, missed its target by half a mile. That's not so bad. It's better to miss than to hit, maybe, you can argue. But the second test, called Baker, right? They completely messed up. They detonated the bomb. I'm sorry that that's not so visible, huh? They detonated the bomb underwater in the lagoon. It tossed an immense cloud of radioactive water into the sky, but it also created a cavity in the lagoon because it tossed up huge amounts of coral, sand, and sediment. Anyone who knew anything about nuclear weapons would know that that would irradiate that material. The neutrons hit the sand, the sediment, and make them radioactive. So this immense cloud of plutonium, uranium, fission products, what happens when you split apart plutonium and uranium, and all this activation product of the sand and the coral rained down on 200 ships, making them tremendously radioactive. They disabled a large part of the US fleet. They had to cancel the third test because the support ships were too radioactive to use. Then some genius made a command decision to have, yeah, there you go. Take a look at how tiny those are compared to the blast. Some genius made a command decision to send the support ships into the lagoon after the blast and turn on their evaporator systems, sucking the radioactive water from the lagoon into the ships, contaminating therefore not just the outside from everything that fell on them, but the inside of the ships as well. They literally disabled a large portion of the US fleet. And so, take a look at the blast here of the Independence. See the two guys there?
Jim John, huh?
Well, they weren't on the ship when it was blown up, but you can see the damage that was done to the carrier. It's still burning in this picture. This is what they did to try to clean up after the second blast, after the blasts. So sailors in no protective equipment whatsoever, with hoses and brooms. And it didn't succeed in decontaminating the ships at all. It succeeded in contaminating the sailors. They got so desperate they used coconut shells and coffee grounds and barley hulls to try to decontaminate the ships, completely failing. One of the things you need to know about radioactivity is it often tends to be sticky, tends to stick to materials. They couldn't get it off. And eventually they found there was a large amount of plutonium that wasn't showing up on the radiation badges of the sailors at levels that were so high that they were way over even the limits in those days. And the sailors were tracking those through the masts, through all of the ship. So you had the outside of the ships contaminated, the insides of the ships contaminated, and a couple hundred ships disabled. And the efforts to decontaminate at sea failed. So what did the Navy do? This is why you're here. They decided to bring 79 of those contaminated ships to Hunters Point. Nearly 10 or so of them were so disabled that they had to be towed here. And they tried over a period of years to decontaminate these ships. Now, you all know the fundamentals of radiation. You cannot neutralize radioactivity by physical means. All you can do is move it. So decontamination of these ships meant getting the radioactivity off of the ships onto Hunters Point. And again, low-income community, minority community, sacrifice zone, they just kind of didn't think about it, didn't enter their minds yet. So they took the arms race from the Pacific and brought it to San Francisco, brought it to Hunters Point. And in berths and in dry docks, and this is the most amazing picture. How did they decontaminate the contaminated ships? They sandblasted them and steam cleaned them. Here is the worker in the protective garb of the time, sandblasting. You can't see well from this projection of the photograph, but the sand is just going way off into the air. Workers who were present at the time said that the wind carried the contaminated sandblast throughout the shipyard. So think about this, years and years of sandblasting contaminated ships. And in addition to the 79 from Operation Crossroads, there were additional ships brought in subsequent years because Hunters Point Shipyard was made the center of something called the Naval Radiological Defense Laboratory, or my students like to refer to as NERDL for some reason. NERDL then participated in every nuclear weapons test in the Pacific during most of the 1950s. And they brought back to Hunters Point vast quantities of nuclear weapons debris for analysis, filled with plutonium, uranium, fission products, activation products. They also then had licenses for vast amounts of radioactive materials of their own. 2,000 grams of plutonium, huge amounts of uranium, of cesium, of strontium, for their own research. So you had, in addition to the sandblasting, there were over 600,000 gallons of radioactive fuel oil that were taken off of the ships that had been contaminated in the Pacific and brought to Hunters Point to be burned in boilers on site. So again, what went out those stacks readily could settle on much of the area as well. The Navy doesn't even know how that diesel fuel got contaminated, but they burned it on site. So one mechanism for airborne release is sandblasting, another one the burning of the contaminated fuel oil, and numerous other mechanisms. I'll tell you just a few as we go through here. But they had, for example, let's see if this is so this is again the Independence. Terribly radioactive, brought back to Hunters Point, kept here for several years, and eventually loaded up with barrels of radioactive waste and taken out to the Farallon Islands to be dumped, to be scuttled. In addition to the aircraft carrier being scuttled there, the Hunters Point collected something on the order of 40,000 barrels, 55-gallon drums of radioactive waste, not just from Hunters Point, but from Lawrence Livermore Nuclear Weapons Laboratory, Alameda Shipyard, and so on, which were brought to Hunters Point. Those barrels left largely outdoors, rain coming on them, stuff migrating, and eventually the barrels were taken out to Farallon Islands and dumped as well. So, and here's just a picture of one of the barrels at the Farallons, and you can see the crab on top of it. Fish swimming by, radioactive material shown up in the fish near the barrels at the Farallon Islands. It tends to work its way up the food chain. It's one more marvelous metaphor that you can dump stuff in the ocean, but it comes back to you in the fish you eat. You can blow up nuclear weapons in the Pacific. It's brought back to San Francisco. During the nuclear weapons tests in the Pacific, they placed goats and all sorts of other animals on the ships to then see what the effect would be of radiation at various distances. The reason we put in this photo is because vast numbers of animals were brought to Hunters Point to experiment on with radioactivity and dosed with radiation as well. They had outdoor pens. I mean, some of the creatures were as small as bees, but they had goats and other very large ones as well. And so, of course, the excrement and the urine in the outdoor pens, radioactive. When the rain comes, that stuff gets spread as well. The carcasses were supposedly, if radioactive, taken out to the Farallons and dumped, but my experience at such sites is that they would do that only with the most radioactive. The rest of the animals, they admit that they burned, incinerated in the incinerators at Hunters Point, another mechanism for release. So it wasn't just the animals that got contaminated. All the sailors who were scrubbing down those contaminated ships got contaminated themselves, and they had to get scrubbed down. So they had to get washed, and then their clothes had to get washed. So there were actually a contaminated nuclear laundry at Hunters Point, where all this very contaminated clothing would get washed. Well, what is washing? Washing doesn't neutralize radioactivity also. It is a process of getting it out of the clothes, into the rinse water, and down the drain. Well, for the laundry and for the showers, that stuff, radioactive, went down the drains, and like many sewer pipes, they leaked. And so the radioactivity leaked into the soil surrounding the pipes. So, from our review of the historical record, there is significant potential for any part of Hunters Point to have contamination. You say yes.
Has there been any study about what happened to the workers that did this work?
So there have been studies of what are called the atomic vets, the soldiers, sailors, and so on that participated in nuclear weapons tests. I frankly don't know, and one of the students, would you make a note? We should try to double check whether they focused on any of the Operation Crossroads or the Pacific Test people. I am unaware of any studies of the workers at Hunters Point. I have spent 40 years dealing with a similar site in Southern California, and there we were able to press, with the help of legislators, for independent studies of the workers and then of the off-site population. That study in Southern California found that the workers had substantially increased cancer death rates. Yes, please. Sorry. Yes.
Professor, I agree with you 100% on everything. I sat on Navy's remediation advisory board. I'm Dr. Tompkins, and I chaired the technical committee for 6 years, and I had EPA grant for 4. And because of those who did the dirty work here on the shipyard, were African Americans, they did not do any studies. Also, on the bacterial studies in 1950, when they released bacteria, we had to go to the BBC and some of the senior residents that lived here. We did our own research. No American source of information. And when we did come up with data on the 11 people that they found that were sick and the 3 that died, no African Americans were included in any of the studies. Also, the animals that were radiated, when they didn't burn them, they gave them to the black workers to put on their backs, and they carried them over to your Superfund parcel E2, and the workers called them the pit, because all it was a pit dug in, and they never taught the sailors, they never gave them protective clothing, as the professor showed very clearly. They never told the wife, don't wash his clothes with the children's clothes, don't wear your work shoes in the homes. So that in the 90s, when Dr. Gillis and some of us reviewed breast cancer rates for African American women, it was the highest in the world.
Appreciate impressed by it. Just by the way, it's been said a second time, I just want to make clear, my teaching title at the university was that of a lecturer, not professor, just keep the record. So, you have all these mechanisms whereby the material could have been dispersed. Sandblasting, the burning of contaminated fuel oils. There was a wide array of radionuclides, extensive earth moving, even the helicopters. You know, there's a police building at the center of the shipyard, and they have a helicopter pad.